Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. You know, once upon a time on the Weekly Pull podcast, Sal made a joke. And this joke was based on the idea of the New 52, DC's reboot. And he's like, the way I bet this went down, it was something to this effect. I'm paraphrasing here, right? This was 3 years ago. He was like, I bet they were all sitting in a boardroom, right? Like they were all sitting in a room and they were talking about like Flashpoint and everything that's going to happen. It's like, okay, so like here's a story, here's what happens, here's what takes place. And then at the end of it, Barry Allen goes back and he lets his mom die and then everything goes back to normal. And somebody was like, but what if it didn't though? What if the whole timeline reset and like we basically reboot, right? Like that's how New 52 came into existence. I feel like that's kind of what's happening here. The thing about Scott Snyder, and I want to kind of preface this for a minute, the thing about Scott Snyder, he is a ridiculously amazing writer, right? Like there's no doubting that point. Scott Snyder is nuts at what he does. I'd almost be scared to see like a Scott Snyder Marvel story. But I feel like this started out as just kind of a story that Snyder wanted to do. And then it feels like it's turning into a reboot. That's exactly what it feels like it's turning into. DC says it's not what's happening, but it feels like it is, right? Like it feels like it's turning into a reboot, right? So, and you guys will see what I'm talking about by the time we get to the end of this. But what we end up doing here is we pick up initially with kind of the aftermath of the last story that we did. And up to this point, we've more or less kind of had the day saved. All the plot threads have been wrapped up except for one. You had the speedsters who were basically outrunning the Batman Who Laughs in pursuit of the Mobius chair. They ultimately ended up getting it, and now they've kind of gotten back to safety. You had the Green Lanterns who had kind of gone into the multiverse along with Captain Carrot and all those different guys. And their job was to basically destroy the antennas that were powering Perpetua, which they successfully did. The only real remaining plot thread that was left here was Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, right? And the idea behind them is that they were going to go into what was effectively these different crises worlds, right? They were going to go into the Dark Multiverse, and they were going to find the Dark Multiverse versions of the original Crisis on Infinite Earths, Infinite Crisis, and Final Crisis, right? The three major crisis events that DC's done. But you kind of have that going on. And the idea was that you ended up having like Jarro, and you had Jonah Hex, and you had Swamp Thing and Harley Quinn, and they were kind of staying behind as anchors, that when the time came when the missions of Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman were completed, that they would basically yank them back out of the Dark Multiverse and into the positive multiverse, and then, you know, they would go on and basically face off against the Batman Who Laughs. And the whole idea here is that when they arrived here, when Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman arrived in their respective crises, it was not what they thought it was, right? Batman showed up here into the original Crisis on Infinite Earths event, and everything was just all white, and he was just met with what looked like this little kid who revealed himself to be the Anti-Monitor. And that's what he says here, right? Like Batman's like, okay, we have these Alfred boxes. The whole idea is to take this crisis energy to basically absorb the entirety of this universe, more or less, into these little Alfred boxes, and then take that energy and then give it to like Wally West, right? So that Wally West can basically be powered up using his portion of the power of Dr. Manhattan and then destroy the Batman Who Laughs. And the whole point is that once he gets here, he basically realizes it's the Anti-Monitor. And the Anti-Monitor basically says, no, like this is not the Crisis on Infinite Earths that you remember. That version, that crisis that you recall, that crisis was you guys fighting a whole bunch of, fighting me, like you guys, the heroes, the villains, all fighting me. Me and the Spectre fought each other, and then we basically wiped out the entire multiverse in the process. I was ultimately defeated, and a new universe was born into existence. He's like, that's not what happened. In this Crisis on Infinite Earths, I won. The antimatter universe won, and I wiped out all positive matter across the multiverse. There is nothing here but me. I am the only thing in this universe. It's all antimatter in this universe. And it's kind of nuts. Somewhere along the line, he seems to have had an encounter with the Batman Who Laughs, who basically seemed to secure this victory for him, right? Or at the very least, tell him what he needed to do in order to win. And he basically says, like, I won against everybody, right? Like, you lost here. And so initially, you know, the funny thing is Batman's like, you have to give this thing back. And the response of Anti-Monitor is, no, that's not going to happen. Now from here, you switch over to the Final Crisis. And it's kind of interesting the way this is done, right? Because it kind of blends two concepts of the Final Crisis together. As most of you guys know, when it came to the Crisis events in DC Comics, right? Crisis on Infinite Earths destroyed the multiverse. Infinite Crisis brought it back, and Final Crisis made the heroes aware of the multiverse's return, right? That was the whole idea behind this. And the nature was that during the Final Crisis, it was kind of the quote-unquote death of Darkseid to a degree, but Darkseid ended up returning on Earth and then trying to secure the anti-life equation, which he successfully did. But while that was going on, you also had another story involving a character named Mandrak, who was kind of like this fallen monitor. It was weird. Grant Morrison was writing like two stories at the same time in one story, and it made it overly complicated and exceedingly confusing for a lot of people. But the idea is that Darkseid, of course, was defeated at the end of that story, and then so was Mandrak, right? Mandrak was defeated, but it took the combined efforts of pretty much all the remaining Supermen from across the multiverse to defeat Mandrake, right? What happens here, it looks as though Mandrake was successfully defeated, but Darkseid won, right? Darkseid basically ended up taking over. The funny thing about this too, and this is what's kind of crazy about this, is that when Superman gets here, he's kind of looking at that, right? He's talking to Darkseid, and Darkseid, like he's like, your energy signature, like you're the real Darkseid, and he's like, yes, I am the real and definitive Darkseid. Now, one of the ideas that you have out there in DC Comics is you have kind of two versions of Darkseid, so to speak, right? You have every version of Darkseid that you've seen, and then you have True Form Darkseid. Now, True Form Darkseid, we did a Beyond Omega level video on. That one was really kind of fan service. The reality is that a True Form Darkseid is really more of a fan theory. It's not actually set in stone. It's just something that people believe exists out there, largely because of Grant Morrison, but that's the only real indication to believe that it's true. There's nothing definitive in DC that says, like, you know, there's a True Form Darkseid or True Form Darkseid out there anywhere. But the idea is that if that theory rings true, then you've basically got Darkseid as he actually exists, right? Like the walking, talking embodiment of pure evil, which can never truly be destroyed. And then you've got like the version that Superman fought during Final Crisis, or that Superman's fought at any point in time. And that's like an avatar, right? So basically it's like a weaker version, like a weaker projection of Darkseid himself. But True Form Darkseid could never actually truly be destroyed. The other thing that's interesting about this is that if this is the true signature of Darkseid, then what it basically looks like is that the Batman Who Laughs went and met with Darkseid and said, hey, like, I can take you to a place where you can win, right? Like, you lost during Final Crisis, but I can take you to a place where you can win Final Crisis. And he basically ended up bringing Darkseid to the Dark Multiverse, right? It's the only real way to reconcile this, that this is Darkseid from the positive matter multiverse in the Dark Multiverse, and he successfully conquered the world using the anti-life equation, has dominated the wills of everybody on Earth. More so than that, when we talk about Mandrake and the different Supermen from across the multiverse, you've got different Supermen here, right? Like, you've got like Red Sun Superman and so on, and these guys being here and all basically being servants to Darkseid kind of shows that a coming together of the Supermen from across what was left of the multiverse during Final Crisis happened, and that seemingly Darkseid managed to get his hands on them and basically ended up enslaving them. Now, it's kind of important to understand there's a lot that's not being explained here by Scott Snyder, right? There's a lot that's just not being done here, and this is why I say I feel like this is kind of a reboot, or it's kind of the tail end of it kind of seems to be rushed pretty fast, because Snyder's not really one to kind of leave you dangling on questions with a story like this. If it was like a great big huge ongoing event, so if we were talking about like his New 52 Batman run, then you would see like the introduction of a plot thread that would become important like 3 or 4 story arcs down the road. But as far as I'm aware, this is not going to be some great big huge long lasting event that's going to span for 3 years, right? This is not Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers. This is just a single self-contained story, and then we move on to the next one. And so it's kind of strange here that Snyder would sort of give that to us. But the thing that Darkseid basically says is like, all these guys are my servants here, and so what we're going to do with you is we're going to put you in the pits of apocalypse. We're going to put you in this, not really the pits of apocalypse, but we're going to put you in the fire pits, and you're going to re-emerge as my final son, right? You're the one thing that's basically standing in my way here. Once I have this, then essentially we'll bring an end to this crisis, and we will pass this energy on to Batman Who Laughs, and that'll be the end of it. And then you end up switching over to the Infinite Crisis with Superboy Prime. Of all the different villains who are here, Superboy Prime is actually the most rational. And I know it doesn't really make any sense to say that. I know it sounds weird. I mean, this is a guy who punched reality, lost his mind, and attacked the heroes. But the important thing to understand about Superboy Prime is he never came from a place of evil. The idea behind Superboy Prime is that he was basically a character from before the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, right? He was from Earth Prime back before Crisis happened. But because of the fact that there was no more multiverse, and because DC kind of wanted to write his character out, they ended up basically moving him on to the Paradise Dimension. And up until the events of Infinite Crisis, the Paradise Dimension was basically more or less like a heaven kind of place, right? Where he would basically go on and find peace. Now, in the events leading up to Infinite Crisis, which was a storyline called Countdown, you kind of ended up getting this explanation that the Paradise Dimension was supposed to be a place of happiness. But one, it was poisoning Lois Lane, who was originally from Earth 2 before the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and Superboy Prime was watching all the heroes, right? And from a publishing standpoint, when you're looking at the post-crisis landscape, because of stories like The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller and Batman Year One, you saw stories getting progressively darker, right? The heroes becoming edgier, more of anti-heroes than traditional heroes. And so it was, Jeff Johns kind of wrote that in the sense that he was almost kind of putting himself in the place of Superboy Superboy Prime, right? That Jeff Johns, as a writer, had kind of become dissatisfied with the darker nature of DC's stories. And Superboy Prime, inside this Paradise Dimension, had looked into the main DC universe and continually monitored it, and basically said that, like, there was a time when heroes fought bad guys, right? You knew who the heroes were, you knew who the bad guys were, there was no blurring of lines there. But now the lines are blurred all over the place. And in his dissatisfaction and his frustration, he was manipulated into shattering this barrier of the Paradise Dimension, which led to a bunch of reboots, right? The return of Red Hood and all that kind of stuff. But that's what led to the introduction of Superboy Prime. But he's not a traditional villain. And that's kind of the important thing is Wonder Woman's chance to kind of reconcile with him is what's interesting here, because you basically have this situation where, like, you still have the towers, right? The towers that were used to recreate the multiverse during the original Infinite Crisis event. You have these towers that are here, which he's currently imprisoned in, but Superboy Prime's like, in this world that I live in, right? This universe that I'm in, I made you guys better, you know, and then that's kind of the funny thing. And it's a really good way for Snyder to kind of pay homage to Superboy Prime, because we never actually got a chance to see what a universe under Superboy Prime would look like, right? Like, what would that Earth look like? And we're kind of given a glimpse here, and we're basically shown that it's a return to the old school way of doing things, right? It's a return to the way DC Comics was in like the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, right? That, like, there were good guys and there were bad guys, and there were no blurring of lines here, right? There were no anti-heroes, there was no good guys who sometimes do bad things because the ends justify the means. It wasn't like that, right? That it was a good guys, a moral compass, they always did good things, they never broke from that moral compass, and that was the end of it. And so by all standards of measurement, he's actually made things better. And it's kind of a funny thing, because with Wonder Woman trying to reconcile with him, right? Wonder Woman talking to him here, one of the things she says is where Superboy Prime says that, like, you know, in a few minutes, these Alfred boxes, right? The one in the anti-light or the anti-monitor universe, the Crisis on Infinite Earths universe, the one that Darkseid has during Final Crisis, and this one, we're going to destroy all these, and all this energy is going to be sent directly to the Batman Who Laughs. And the idea was the reason why these exist here in the first place, because remember, the Batman Who Laughs created these worlds, right? So that's why I say seemingly he went to Darkseid and said, here's a world where you won Final Crisis, right? He went to Anti-Monitor, said, here's a world where you won the original Crisis on Infinite Earths event, and he went to Superboy Prime and said, here's a world where you basically won Infinite Crisis. When those worlds are destroyed, that energy will be sent to, you know, the Batman Who Laughs, who will amplify himself. But one other thing that I want to talk about here is Superboy Prime being here in the first place. So the last time that we saw Superboy Prime, or at least, you know, kind of the time before the last time we saw his character, he was locked in the Source Wall, and the Source Wall was destroyed. And the question that a lot of fans had is, where's Superboy Prime, right? It's one of the first things people asked. We didn't really hear hide nor hair of his character until we got to Jeff Johns' Shazam run. But the whole thing here is that Superboy Prime kind of was defeated and then quote unquote handed over to the Justice League. We don't know how this reconciles, right? We're not entirely sure where these two things stand. I mean, the fact that he's here kind of points to the idea that he was basically taken by the Batman Who Laughs from the Justice League, that seemingly when all this popped off, right, the whole Dark Knight's Metal event popped off, that what this meant was that Superboy Prime was, you know, he was kind of probably left in some prison cell by himself, and then Batman Who Laughs came, took him, and then brought him here, right? You know, that kind of seems to have been the case. We could just sort of explain it away until we actually get an explanation from someone. But the funny thing is that this world he created is a great world. Sure, it was built on the suffering of others, right? It probably required him to kill some people, but he did make a better world. And notice how Wonder Woman fights against him. The funny thing about this is oftentimes I think people kind of adopt this mentality that, like, I want things to get better, but I don't want to sacrifice anything in the process. And if you want to make an omelet, sometimes you got to break a few eggs. And so because of that, you know, it looked as though Superboy Prime conquering this world, while it doesn't really look like the heroes are subservient, the reality is we're not given a lot of context here, right? We're not really shown a lot of context in terms of what his world looks like outside of the image that he gives us, right? But it looks like it's Scott Snyder basically saying, like, the world Superboy Prime made is actually a better world. It is actually better than it was before he took power, right? So it's kind of interesting, right? It's kind of an intriguing thing. But from there, we actually kind of step to an aside for a second, and we end up picking up with, like, Robin King and these guys, right? Now, Robin King does have his own one-shot. If you guys are interested, we can cover it. But, you know, the idea was that Robin King had kind of shown up and launched an attack against, like, Swamp Thing and Jarro and Harley Quinn and Jonah Hex and all them, and Jonah Hex ended up staying behind. And so once that escape was made, the concern was that Jarro would be cut off from, like, Wonder Woman and all of them and wouldn't be able to pull them out of the Crisis worlds in order to save the day. And so what ended up happening here is Robin King basically kind of pops back up with the head of Jonah Hex. And whereas he's kind of begged, you know, where Harley Quinn kind of begs, hey, like, can you like let him go, right? I mean, there's really nothing left for you to hurt anymore. Robin King, kind of being as twisted and screwed up as he is, right? This little Bruce Wayne who's just a total dick. It's kind of like, no, I mean, there's always more to hurt. But one of the things that he brings up here is basically this knife that was forged by a guy named Neron, who's considered the Lord of Hell. And he says, if you're stabbed with it and you're a sinner, then you basically go straight to the lowest pit of hell. And he's like, that's where the demon demons basically take this form of the people that you've hurt over the course of your life, and they peel your skin off every single day, and every night it grows back, and you basically endure that process for all eternity. And so Harley Quinn initially tries to launch an attack after Robin King basically stabs Jonah Hex and ends up killing him, sending him to the lowest pit of hell. And then of course, you know, Harley Quinn is stopped by Jarro because it's kind of like, we don't really have time for this. From there, like, you know, it's kind of a psychic attack of sorts is made where it kind of seems to, you know, either crush, you know, Robin King, you know, with a whole bunch of rubble, or at the very least kind of create a little barrier there, but it gives him time to run away, right? It gives him time to get away. And so kind of jumping back to the various other characters here, you basically end up kind of, you know, traveling back to the Crisis on Infinite Earths event. And the idea is that the Anti-Monitor starts breaking down Batman, right? He basically starts to dissolve Batman in this Crisis universe using antimatter to eliminate his existence, right? And then from there, he crushes the Alfred box. At that point, you switch over to Darkseid, who fully submerges Superman inside of the fire pits. And Superman is kind of like, okay, like there's nothing he can do, right? Like he begs. It's almost like the beginning of Earth 2 from New 52, if you guys read that. And then of course Darkseid ends up crushing the Alfred box as well. And then you've got Superboy Prime. And the idea is that the antenna is getting ready to fire up, you know, and it's getting ready to divert all this crisis energy directly to the Batman Who Laughs, and or at least to the Mobius chair, right? You know, who Batman Who Laughs will have. But the whole point here is, again, to kind of reiterate, the Alfred boxes will basically be used to take all this crisis energy and send it into the Mobius chair. And so the whole thing here is that Wonder Woman kind of begs, right? And this is what's interesting, is she kind of makes this case where she's like, you know, the only thing out there, the only constant out there in existence, Prime, is change. Things change. People are afraid of change. The idea of Superboy Prime is such that where he was always depicted as a character who was kind of locked in the past. But it's kind of funny because looking at this, you know, I'm almost inclined to sort of adopt this mentality that just because things change does not mean they change for the better. And that was the stance of Superboy Prime. Kind of looking at it, you know, a little more exclusively, that was the stance of its character. Just because things have changed does not mean they're better. And Wonder Woman begs and pleads, right? She's like, I want you to picture the whole multiverse, right? Picture the entire multiverse, an infinite multiverse, right? Every single Earth is unique, but they're all connected. There's an Earth out there somewhere where you can have the light, you can have the Earth, the reality that you want, right? Where you can have a place where the heroes are the way that you always imagine them, right? Like it has to exist out there somewhere. We simply just haven't found it yet, and that's a place that you can call home. But it's kind of interesting because, you know, making this case, things change, they do. But ultimately, like Wonder Woman basically ends up breaking herself free, and then initially, you know, tries to go after Superboy Prime, or at least he throws her, you know, into a wall, and the two of them seem to kind of engage into a little bit of a fight. All the while, the antenna's continually counting down, right? And then it says like it's ready to fire, and that's when you end up finding out here the antenna is basically an anchor point, that the energy of the Crisis on Infinite Earths reality where Anti-Monitor is, and the energy of the Final Crisis reality where Darkseid is, those are channeled into the antenna on the Infinite Crisis universe where Superboy Prime is, and that antenna will in turn fire that energy into the Mobius chair like a cannon shot. And so what you end up getting here is Wonder Woman, who successfully manages to rationalize with Superboy Prime, that in his frustration he basically goes to attack her and says stop, right? Because and the way she does this is actually really cool. The way she does this is a Superboy Prime's belief with the whole idea of the multiverse is saying the problem with that is we still have to believe that, or we still have to accept the fact that there will be other worlds out there that will destroy ours, right? Like it's a shot in the dark. If I ally with the Batman Who Laughs, he will give me the Earth that I want, and there will be nobody out there who can destroy it, right? There'll be nobody out there to destroy the world because there will be nobody left. But she says at the end of the day though, that's really all it is, right? Like you idolize Superman, right? You look to Superman as the greatest hero of all time, you idolize him. Isn't that all he really is? Just a shot in the dark, the hope that things can get better? That's really what Superman is though. The idea of Superman was to lead people to a better future, not drag them there, not force them there, but to show people a better way. But this kind of rationale resonates with Superboy Prime. And what you end up basically getting is the destruction of Darkseid's reality, the destruction of the Crisis on Infinite Earths reality, and this energy basically being channeled into the Mobius chair by Superboy Prime, right? Superboy Prime allies himself with Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. Now, this also kind of begs the question, how is it that Superman is kind of back to normal? I guess it's just the result of the reality being destroyed. I don't really know. We're not really given an answer here. But ultimately, you end up having, you know, Jarro, who's able to reach out, kind of bring them back to the positive matter multiverse. The problem is that when they get back here, the energy itself was all transferred into the Mobius chair, but it didn't work. And the reason why it didn't work is that the Batman Who Laughs rigged the Mobius chair so that when the energy was transferred into the chair, it would automatically be diverted to the Batman Who Laughs. And he basically says, all this energy is now in me, right? Like I have essentially reached my final form. I am empowered by all the energy of Dr. Manhattan. And so he says, let me be the first person to welcome you to my new age. When all this kicked off, we had the new 52. Now we have the last 52 worlds in existence. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.